Prakim, and we went on a little bit of a digression, and I want to just finish the digression, and that is we were discussing the Chait of Mei Meriva, the Chait of Moshe Rabbenu in the waters of strife, and because of that Chait, at the end of in the middle of Parshas Chukas, Moshe Rabbenu was not allowed to enter the Eretz Yisrael, Moshe and Aaron, and again, according to Rashi, the Aveira was Hashem wanted him to speak to the rock, and Moshe Rabbenu deviated, intentionally or unintentionally, by hitting the rock. And that was a chait, because had Bnei Yisrael seen that even the words of God can even influence a rock, they would have made a kal v'chomer that it should influence them. And therefore Moshe Rabbenu failed, number one, to sanctify Hashem's name, and number two, rebelled against Hashem. That's why it mentions both things. You weren't Makadesh my name, and you rebelled against me. So according to Rashi, the mitzvah was to speak to the rock. Hashem did tell Moshe to take the staff, right? How does Rashi understand that? Why was Moshe taking the staff? The answer was that in Hashem's original intention, the taking the staff was simply, that kind of gave him the spiritual koach to be mashpia on the rock through dibur. In other words, the staff was always, just like Moshe Rabbenu did many miracles through the staff. So the koach to speak to the rock would have been enabled by taking the mateh. But according to Rashi, taking the mateh is not a suggestion of actually hitting the rock. Right? This is Rashi's pshat. This is probably the most famous interpretation. Do you have a question? Yeah.
When Hashem directly commands people to do these one-time things, are these mitzvot, like on top of the 613 mitzvot?
Okay, so that's a very interesting question. The Rambam, like, why isn't there a mitzvah called speak to the rock, right? So the Rambam actually lays down a rule. When the Rambam, in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, before the Rambam enumerates the 613, the Rambam gives you criteria for what is included in the 613 and what is not. And the Rambam says, Beferish, in the fourth Shorish, he has 14 Shorashim, he says, any mitzvah that was a temporary commandment or a one-time act is not considered one of the 613 mitzvahs. The 613 mitzvahs are only the permanent mitzvahs and not the one-time mitzvahs. For example, we don't count do not eat from the tree of knowledge. We don't count that as a mitzvah because, once again, that was like a one-time thing. So that's a good point. So in a sense, it is a mitzvah in the sense that it's a divine command, but it's not in the 613 number, which is permanent mitzvahs and not temporary ones. Okay. In fact, even things that lasted more than one time. For example, the Rambam says, God commanded Bnei Yisrael not to leave the man overnight. Now, that was a mitzvah in effect for 40 years, and we do not count that as 613 mitzvahs. Okay. Now, again, the Rambam understands that hitting the rock was actually not a problem. In other words, the Rambam doesn't address this explicitly, but I'm assuming that's the pshat, because if the Rambam has to come up with a different explanation than Rashi, I think the safe implication was there was no sin in hitting the rock. That's my addition to the Rambam's commentary. And why was there no sin in hitting the rock? Because, presumably, if Hashem said take the stick, he meant to hit the rock. So hitting the rock wasn't the Aveira, but the Rambam says the two Aveiros were anger. Moshe Rabbenu deviated from the middle to the extreme of anger. And number two, he distorted or misrepresented Hashem because people figured if Moshe was angry, Hashem must be angry. And the Rambam says, interestingly enough, Hashem was not angry at people who were desperate because they didn't have water. It's a chiddush, actually. The Rambam says there was no divine anger. God is angry if you're not happy with the man and you want steak. So Hashem says, why? But if you don't have water and you're afraid, Hashem understands that, so to speak. And Memela, there was no anger, and Moshe Rabbenu rebelled, not in the sense of rebelling, but in the sense of distorting Hashem's will vis-a-vis what Bnei Yisrael thought. That it's not good for a person to think Hashem doesn't like you, when in fact Hashem does like you, right? That's a leader should not be in the business of conveying a negative impression of Bnei Yisrael. Yeah.
Sorry, just to go back on previously in regards to Rambam Sefer Mitzvot.
Yeah.
does Rambam hold that when there's Yimei Gula and Yimei Mashiach, that we're not going to be having devices on the same level? Like there's not going to be Chagim. I think that's an idea, is it not? And if so, doesn't that show the transience of those mitzvot now? And
Yeah. So here's the thing. That actually is that statement is actually not true according to the Rambam himself. If you look at the Rambam in Hilchos Malachim, the Rambam says beferish that when Mashiach comes, all of the mitzvos of Hashem are going to remain in effect, including Korbanos, Yomim Tovim, and the like. And he understood the statement, all the holidays will be batal except for Purim. He understood that to mean, in a relative sense, Purim will be the most important of the holidays, but it does not mean you're not going to keep the Yomim Tovim. In fact, this is a famous word from Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, to digress for a total digression here. We know that in addition to the annual mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, there's a daily mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. Every single day we are mechuyev to mention the Exodus. And that's why we say in Kriya Shema, in Parshas Tzitzis. Parshas Tzitzis is not part of Kriya Shema. Kriya Shema is only the first two Parshas. Parshas Tzitzis is not part of Kriya Shema, but we say it, number one, because Tzitzis is a remes to the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. And number two, we have the pasuk, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, Asher Hotzeisi Eschem Me'eretz Mitzrayim. And I think the article Siddur even says, when you say the verse, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, you should have kavana to fulfill the mitzvah of remembering, verbally, not just in your head, remembering Yetzias Mitzrayim. And we do this in the day, and we do this at night. So a big kasha that is asked on the Rambam is, if there is a mitzvah called Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, why does the Rambam not list it in the 613 mitzvahs? If you look at the 613 mitzvahs, it is not listed as a mitzvah, even though it is a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that's not listed. Why is it not listed? So says Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, a gewaldige thing. We find that we do it in the day and at night, right? And that's because we follow Ben Zoma's opinion, who says you have to do it in day and night, right? The Haggadah brings this. Now, if you remember, the Chachamim argue with Ben Zoma. The Chachamim say, no, you don't do it at night. And when the Torah says you have to remember the Exodus all the days of your life, the riboy is not night. The riboy is even when Mashiach comes. And the miracles are going to be greater, you got to remember the Exodus. So it turns out we have a machlokas Ben Zoma and the Chachamim. What is the meaning of the pasuk? You must remember the Exodus from Egypt all the days of your life. What is the all including? According to Ben Zoma, all means night. According to the Chachamim, all means Mashiach. It turns out that these are mutually exclusive drashas. If you say kol means night, we're not going to mention Yetzias Mitzrayim when Mashiach comes, because that's going to be superseded by the greater miracles. If you say kol means Mashiach, you don't do it at night. In other words, it's either night and not Mashiach, or Mashiach and not night. That's the structure of the Gemara. So says Rav Chaim, since the Rambam paskins, you're mechuyev to do it by day and night, he paskins like Ben Zoma. That means the Rambam holds that unlike other mitzvahs, you're not going to mention Yetzias Mitzrayim when Mashiach comes. So even though it's a chiyuv, we don't count it in the 613 mitzvahs because it's a mitzvah that's not going to apply when Mashiach comes. That's Rav Chaim's teretz of why it is not enumerated as a mitzvah. But the implication is everything else will be. That's an exception. In fact, Rav Yitzhak even asks, how could the Rambam make a statement that all mitzvahs are going to remain when Mashiach comes? We at least have one mitzvah that's not. Remembering the Exodus. Okay, so obviously that's an exception. So So that would be my answer. My answer is Eino Chinami. Rav Chaim actually says any mitzvah that will be nullified when Mashiach comes is not going to be one of the 613. It has to be a permanent mitzvah. Okay. So now I just want to share with you, as we conclude this, I just want to share with you a very interesting Targum Yonoson ben Uziel. And the Targum Yonoson ben Uziel, first of all, who and what is the Targum Yonoson ben Uziel? That's worthy of a little time as well. We know that Yonoson ben Uziel is a Tana, and he is described as the greatest of the Talmidim of the great Hillel HaZaken. Hillel HaZaken had 80 Talmidim. The greatest of them was Yonoson ben Uziel, and it mentions that his Torah learning was so intense that the Malachim would come to hear him, and if a bird would fly over his head, the bird would be burnt with the fire of his Ruchnius, his Kedusha, the Malachei Yasharis. The Welt likes to say that from this story you can see the difference between a Hasidic mindset and a Litvische mindset. He says, we read the Gemara in Sukkah that if a bird flies over Yonoson ben Uziel while he's learning, the bird gets burnt. So what does a Litvische person think of? What does a Hasidic person think of? So the Hasidic person thinks, you see the holiness of Torah, the holiness of a person who learns Torah, that it generates fire and Kedusha ad kedei kach. How amazing is the Torah, how amazing is the madregas that a human being could reach. He says, the Litvische person will think, who has to pay for the bird? Who's a mazik? Let's say the bird belongs to somebody. He says, am I chayav for supernatural damages? Meaning, I'm learning, I generate a fire. Now, Aish is one of the Avos Nezikin, right? If I start a fire, I'm chayav for damages. Am I chayav for heavenly fire that comes because of my learning, right? So the Litvische person always, thinks about the halachic aspect to every question, right? Different temperament. Like, what do you think about in all of these inyanim? But be it as it may, Yonoson ben Uziel, as many of you know, is buried near Tzfat in a very deep valley called Amuka. Maybe you've been to Amuka. And it is said that Yonoson ben Uziel never married, and he is mispalel for people who are looking for their shidduchim. So Amuka is one of the famous places where people go to be mispalel for a shidduch in the merit of the Tana Yonoson ben Uziel. So what happens is people do their hishtadlus in addition to their tefillah. They often leave. They forget to pick up a siddur, which has their name, address, phone number, and email in the siddur. So often a young woman in Borough Park will contact somebody in Baltimore and say, I found your siddur when I was there, or vice versa. Or the girl leaves the siddur. And the shidduchim are made usually by lost siddurim, which have all the information in it, very much more than you normally put in a siddur, but like all information is there, date of birth, height, whatever. That's in the siddur as well. But that's Amuka, Yonoson ben Uziel. But we know if you open up a Mikros Gedolos, you will see that there are 3 Aramaic translations in a Mikros Gedolos. There is the Targum Onkelos, which is pasuk by pasuk by pasuk. And Onkelos was a ger. Onkelos was a nephew of a Roman emperor, but Onkelos was a Talmud of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. He was a chaver of Rabbi Akiva. And Onkelos wrote the official Targum. And then we have something that is called Targum Yonoson ben Uziel. And there is a very big difference between Targum Onkelos and Targum Yonoson ben Uziel. You could see it right away. Difference number 1, which is not so important for our purposes, is it is a different dialect of Aramaic. Targum Onkelos is written in more of a Babylonian Aramaic, although he wrote it in Eretz Yisrael, but it's more of a dialect of Bavel, similar to Gemara Aramaic. Targum Yonoson ben Uziel is the Eretz Yisrael Aramaic that's in the Yerushalmi and the Midrashim. So Targum Yonoson is a different dialect of Aramaic. That's one difference. But the second and major difference is Targum Onkelos is a very literal word-for-word translation. Now, there are many chidushim in the Targum, but they're kind of hidden. The Targum just translates every word. Targum Yonoson is much less of a translation. It's more of an elaboration. There are many midrashim in the Targum Yonoson ben Uziel. In fact, sometimes the Midrashim have a source in Midrashim, and sometimes he's the source, right? Targum Yonoson doesn't need a source in Midrashim. He was a Tana. So there is a very big difference. Onkelos is a literal Targum for people who didn't know Hebrew, and Targum Yonoson has many, many Midrashim. Now, in addition, you will find another Targum that's called Targum Yerushalmi, but the Targum Yerushalmi is fragmentary, meaning you don't have it on every pasuk, like was from a manuscript that was not complete and the like. And you'll see clearly that Targum Yerushalmi is really another nusach of Targum Yonoson, because the psukim that we have are kind of virtually the same as Targum Yonoson. Now, if you would ask, it's like the old question, who's buried in Grant's tomb, right? So seems like a simple question. So if I were to ask you, who wrote Targum Yonoson ben Uziel, you would normally respond, well, it must have been Yonoson ben Uziel. But the answer is you might be wrong on that. And the problem is, the Gemara in Megillah writes that the Iker Targum of the Torah was written by Onkelos, the Ger. And the Iker Targum on Nevi'im, Yoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malachim, was Yonoson ben Uziel. And indeed, if you open up Nevi'im, Mikros Gedolos, you will see that's Targum Yonoson as well. And the Gemara then says, after Yonoson ben Uziel wrote a Targum on the Nevi'im, this is a Gemara in Megillah, he wanted to write a Targum on the Kesuvim, but in the Kesuvim we have the book of Daniel. By the way, people mispronounce it, including me. We all call the name Daniel. The A, the Tseire, is under the Aleph. If you actually look at where the vowel is positioned, it is under the Yud. So the actual name is not Daniel, it is Daniel. Right? That's what the Tseire is. Okay, but the Welt says Daniel, so we don't have to change it, but be aware that the actual pronunciation is Daniel. Now in Daniel, we do find many, many calculations about the coming of Mashiach. All sorts of numbers are given there. 2,300 days and 1,335 years, and all the Mefarshim go into great depth trying to figure out what this would mean. And they all give dates that already passed, so they didn't get it right. Rashi, Rav Saadia Gaon, Ramban, Malbim even. Yonoson ben Uziel would have cracked the code. Yonoson ben Uziel would have given us the definitive interpretation of when Mashiach is going to come. But what happened was, as he was about to write this down, there was a great earthquake that was destroying Eretz Yisrael. And a voice from Shemayim said, who is the person who dares to reveal my secrets? So because of this, Yonoson ben Uziel did not complete the Targum on the Kesuvim. Okay. But what do you see from the Gemara? Onkelos wrote the Targum on the Chumash. Yonoson ben Uziel wrote the Targum on the Nevi'im. If that's the case, what is Targum Yonoson ben Uziel on the Chumash? The Gemara in Megillah seems to indicate he did not write a Targum on the Chumash. He only wrote a Targum on the Nevi'im. And he would have, which is interesting, by the way, because if you think about it, Yonoson ben Uziel was a Talmud of Hillel. Like, this is a good kasha. And Onkelos was a Talmud of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Now, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua are much later than Hillel. So it's I'm just thinking about this out loud. It's a very strange thing. It turns out, according to the Gemara in Megillah, there was a Targum on Nevi'im earlier than there was a Targum on the Torah. That's a little strange. Why is Onkelos so late? Why is the Targum on the Torah so much later, more than 100 years, so much later than a Targum on Nevi'im? It could be, I'm going to give a very balabatish answer, it could be that the words in Nevi'im are actually harder than the words in the Torah, meaning the vocabulary of the Torah. Obviously the Torah's depth is much greater than anything, but the Hebrew vocabulary of the Torah is an easier vocabulary than the vocabulary of Nevi'im. So even a person who knows Hebrew might find it easier to read the Chumash than it would be to read Yeshayahu, Yechezkel, and the like. So It's interesting, again, and I actually literally never thought of this before, that it comes out according to the Gemara, the Targum on the Chumash is more than 100 years later than the Targum on the Nevi'im. Yeah.
Could it be because the Targum on the Chumash they had then was in Greek? The Mishnah in Megillah talks about like the holiness of the Greek language, and you can write a sacred Torah in Greek.
Well, yeah, that would be the question. I mean, in Eretz Yisrael, they didn't use a Greek Targum. They used it in Alexandria, primarily. So the question would be, maybe it's possible, in fact, maybe it's even probable, that there may have been many Targumim even before Onkelos, but Onkelos became the definitive one, meaning Onkelos is not the first Targum, but Onkelos became the best Targum. But be it as it may, we're back to this question. How can we talk about a Targum Yonoson ben Uziel on the Chumash if the Gemara in Megillah says that Targum Yonoson is only on the Nevi'im? Yeah.
Is the Targum Yonoson on the Nevi'im written in the same style as the Targum Yonoson on the Chumash? Are not literal?
Yes, not to the same degree. The Targum Yonoson on Chumash is more midrashic material, but there is much midrashic material in the Targum Yonoson as well, on Nevi'im. All right. So there are a few answers that are given. Answer number one is that, yeah, Targum Yonoson also wrote a Targum on the Chumash, which would have been earlier, but the Targum Onkelos became the Iker Targum. Right? So that's all the Gemara means. Others say that Targum Yonoson was not written by Targum Yonoson, and in fact, it was an old Targum that was the complete Targum Yerushalmi, and the printers misinterpreted an abbreviation, because when Rashi in Nach says Taf Yud, it means Targum Yonoson. Now those are the same abbreviations for Targum Yerushalmi. So what printers later called Targum Yonoson ben Uziel is not Yonoson ben Uziel. It's anonymous, and it's from the time of the Talmud Yerushalmi, and it's called the Talmud Yerushalmi, which makes sense because the thing that we call Talmud Yerushalmi, which is fragmentary, matches up with Targum Yonoson. Okay, be it as it may. So, and in scholarly academic literature, you will actually find, and this actually fits the Gemara, that the Targum Yonoson ben Uziel on the Chumash is called pseudo Yonoson. That's how it's referred to, or pseudo Jonathan. That is how it is referred to. And again, that's not apikorsis, because that would actually be the Pashat Pshat of the Gemara in Megillah, that Yonoson ben Uziel did not write a Targum on the Torah. Yeah.
What then is Targum Neofiti?
Yes, so Neofiti is a different type of Targum. That's, is that in Syriac? I don't remember the language that it's in. It is a Targum that's even earlier than Onkelos, but it was not regarded as that authoritative. I don't remember. I'll check to be sure. I don't think it's an Aramaic Targum. I think it's either a Greek or a Syriac Targum, but I'll check to be sure. Okay, so be it as it may, whether it's from Yonoson ben Uziel or not, it is from the time of the Tanoim for sure. So it's very, very authoritative. It has the status of a medrash. And here is what the Targum Yonoson interprets the pasuk. It says, Hashem tells Moshe, take the staff, you, Yoshin Yochid, you should take your staff, and you and Aaron, actually, can someone give me a chumash? It depends on reading the psukim very carefully. Okay. So you should know that you are a real base medrash, because you have to leave the room to get a chumash. That's the. So you've made it as a mainstream yeshiva. Okay. Thank you. Sorry to trouble you. Thank you. The Targum Yonoson's diak is really interesting diak. Kach es hamata. Take the mata, gather the people, and you and Aaron should speak to the rock. V'dibartem el hasela le'einayim v'nasan meimav. And then it says, Hotzei solahem mayim min hasela. So there's repetition in the pasuk. It already says, "Speak to the rock, and it will give forth its water." And then it says, "And you will take out water from the rock." That's a redundancy. Do you see the redundancy? It already says, "Dibartem el hasela." First of all, the first part of the pasuk says, "You together will speak to the rock and bring forth the water." And then it goes back to a lashon yachid, "You will take out water from the rock." So number one, why the repetition? Number two, why the switch from plural to singular? So this is what the Targum Yonoson says. Hashem is commanding Moshe and Aaron to speak to the rock. And if they speak to the rock, it will give forth water. But only if the Jewish people are on a madrega that they merit such a supernatural miracle. So Hashem is giving them a contingency plan, meaning, I command you and Aaron to speak to the rock first, so it will give forth water. But if the water does not come from your dibur, then you, Moshe, should hit the rock. You should write. So that's the difference. The reisha of the pasuk, "V'dibartem el hasela," is the lechatchila plan. But if the rock does not respond because the Jewish people are not on a high level, then you, Moshe, should be motzi the water by haka'ah. Which means, according to this pshat, according to Targum Yonoson, God is giving a two-level command. Speak to the rock first, you and Aaron, and if they're on a madrega of Kedusha, they will be zocha to that great miracle. And if not, our fallback position is hit the rock. You see how it's medulik in the psukim. Dibartem v'hotseisa. Now, Hashem obviously knows ahead of time if they're going to be on that madrega or if they're not going to be on the madrega. So why doesn't Hashem just... In other words, this is a very strange double command. Because essentially what Hashem is saying is, if they're deserving, it'll come out by dibur. And if they're not deserving, it'll come out by hakah. Now, if Hashem knows if they're deserving or not deserving, so he either should have said, hit the rock if they're not deserving, or he should have said, speak to the rock if they are deserving. Why does he give a contingency plan? But the Mefarshim say in Targum Yonoson that that's part of Bechira. Hashem knows what we're going to choose. But Hashem relates to our world as if we have a total freedom of choice. And yeah, Hashem knows the end of the story. But Hashem says, I have to give you a chance. If you're Zaycha, the Dibor will be might see the water. If you're not Zaycha, you'll have to hit, right? So this is the first parish I think we have in which Hashem is actually saying both things. Speak, and if that doesn't work, hit. And that explains why Moshe was told to take the staff, because that's the contingency plan. If the dibur is not payal, if the dibur does not work, there will be a haka'ah. The dibur would be done jointly by Moshe and Aaron. The haka'ah would be only by Moshe. That's the switch from the Rabbim to the Yochid. So, what did Moshe Rabbenu do? Moshe Rabbenu knew that the Jewish people were not on a madrega in which they would be zocha to get the water b'dibur. And Moshe Rabbenu was afraid that if he were to speak to the rock, knowing that water would not come out, there would be a chilul Hashem for 1 second till he hits the rock. Because Moshe Rabbenu speaks to the rock and nothing happens. Now, even though a second later he's going to hit the rock, but for that 1 second, people are going to have doubt. They're going to think Hashem does not answer them. Hashem cannot do this miracle. So Moshe Rabbenu decided to skip stage 1 and go straight to stage 2, because stage 2 was guaranteed, right? The dibur only works if we're on a high madrega. Stage 2 is when we're not on a high madrega. So Moshe Rabbenu said, I'm going to skip stage 1. Because since I know ahead of time, I mean Hashem knew also, right? But Moshe says, since I know ahead of time that stage 1 is not going to work, number 1, it's a waste of time. And number 2, it'll create a momentary chilul Hashem. because people will think for a fraction of a second the Torah doesn't work. Therefore, I'll just go to stage 2. So Moshe Rabbenu intentionally did not do the first act that Hashem, he and Aaron, and by the way, this also explains what Aaron's sin was. Like all the other Mefarshim, there's a lot of difficulty. What was Aaron's Avera? Like Rashi, what was Aaron's sin? Aaron didn't do, but according to this, the sin was Moshe and Aaron together. The sin was they decided not to speak to the rock and go to the second stage. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu's taina is that you rebelled against me, number one, because I told you to follow the sequence, and you can't use your own cheshbonais to think that you're smarter than God. You're worried about Chilul Hashem. Hashem says, that's my problem. I want you to speak to the rock because I want there to be at least a theoretical possibility that Am Yisrael will reach a certain madrega, and it's not your business to make a cheshbon that they're not worthy. Right? So this is very, very interesting, very medoyek. Let me just read you the actual lashon of the Targum Yonoson. This is in Parshas Chukas, Perek Chaf, Pasuk Ches. Again, it's a more difficult Aramaic because it's the Yerushalmi Aramaic, is the lesson of the Targum Yonoson. Sav Yas Chutra Nisaya, take the mata that does miracles, Uchanash Yash Kanishta, and gather the assembly. Kanishta is an assembly. Ant V'Aaron Achuch, you and Aaron your brother. V'Sumun Tarichon Yaskipa Bishma Rabba, and you should speak to the rock with the great name of Hashem. Umafarsha kadhinon chamyon v'yitei maye, and then you'll see it'll give forth water. Ve'in yisarev la'fukei mahi, and if it refuses to give forth water, meaning the Jewish people are not deserving, machi ant l'chudech bei b'chutra, you should hit it alone with your stick. Biyadech, and then that way you will bring water out from the rock, right? So this is Targum Yonoson, a whole new pshat that HaKadosh Baruch Hu actually commanded a alternative scenario. You and Aaron speak first, and if that doesn't work, because they're not worthy of that nace, then you hit the rock. Moshe skipped stage 1. He thought it was useless, and it could potentially cause a chilul Hashem. And Hashem says, it is not your job to make cheshbonais. This is a recurring theme throughout Tanakh of the person who has a kavana l'shem shamayim, but it's against what Hashem said. This is by the Meraglim, right? Many Mefarshim learn that the Meraglim wanted us to stay in the Midbar a little longer because we would grow in Emunah, we would grow in faith. It's like staying in Kollel instead of going to work. You know, let's stay in the Midbar where we have the Man and the Be'er and the Ananei HaKavod, and we don't have to have the nisayon of planting fields and having an army. So the Meraglim's kavana was ruchnius. They thought it would be a more spiritual environment in the desert that would prepare us for the challenges of everyday life. And that's a real legitimate cheshbon. It is a legitimate cheshbon. Problem is, God didn't see it that way. God said, you need to go now. So this notion of being smarter than HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in fact, even with the Ched Eitz Hadas, the Alter of Novardik has a Mahalach, which is earlier in Rishonim as well. How could Adam, who is Yitzir Kapav, Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who was created by God, how could Adam and Chava be nichshal in a chet? So there is a cheshbon like this, that until the chet of the Eitz Hadas, Adam Arishan did not have a Yetzer Hara within them. There was a koyach of ra outside of them that caused them to sin, but it was not within them. Adam said, if the tachlis of a human being is to fight my Yetzer Hara, then I am a better Eved Hashem if I bring in the Yetzer Hara and I have to struggle against it than if I don't. So Adam ate l'shem shamayim to be machnis, the Yetzer Hara in him. So now he's going to fight. Because after all, what is the purpose of life without a Yetzer Hara that you're fighting? Why are we here? to fight the Kayach of Ra. But if the enemy is gone, what am I fighting? What is my life about? So Adam said, my life is only meaningful if I bring in the Yetzer Hara and then I fight against it. It's actually a very good kasha. That's such a good cheshbon. Why is it wrong? Because God disagreed. God said, don't eat. They're making a whole lumdas that I need to fight the Yetzer Hara, and that's the purpose of existence, and therefore I have to bring in the Yetzer Hara. Good, good, good. All of that sounds true. But it's keneged the Ratzon Hashem. Which actually brings us to an interesting question, and that is, what was the purpose of God's plan A? Meaning, all of us are living in plan B. Plan B is the universe that was constituted as a result of the chait of the Eitz Hadas. We struggle, we have a Yetzer Hara, we try to conquer our Yetzer Hara. A lot of times we fail, other times we try to succeed. Right? And we understand Lefum Tzara, according to the suffering is the reward. And all of that is the plan B explanation of what life is about. It's an interesting question. What's the plan A explanation of what life was supposed to be about? Meaning, the ideal world that God created, what would have been if Adam HaRishon would not have eaten, Adam and Chava, would not have eaten from the Eitz Hadas? They wouldn't have a Yetzer Hara, they would live forever, there wouldn't be any desire to sin. That sounds great. But what would the purpose of their existence have been without that struggle? In a sense, Adam's argument, the way the author of Navardik explains it, is such a good argument. It's actually hard to understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu's side of the equation. What would the purpose of life have been without this struggle against evil? It's a bit of a tzarachin. We have to think about it. Essentially, it would have just meant we're in Olam Haba without really going through Olam Hazeh. Okay. Does that get you back to the problem of the bread of embarrassment, the bread of shame? Unless the idea is we kept that one mitzvah of not eating from the Eitz Hadas. That would have taken away the embarrassment, and then Hashem will just give us goodness. We don't need that struggle because we had the struggle with the Eitz Hadas, which we happened not to pass, but if we would have passed it, that would have been our struggle. Yeah.
There was a lack in that world. There's a lack of a certain knowledge. Like it says that their eyes were opened after they ate the knowledge.
Yeah, so that's the interesting question. The interesting question is that a suggestion that God's original plan was less perfect? Right? That would be a little, again, I understand your point because it says something happens, they gain something. But, okay, we need to understand that because that would imply that there actually was a certain imperfection in the original Bria that the Chet of Eitz Hadas was Masakin, which is kind of the opposite of the narrative itself, but some learn, in Kabbalah in particular, there is a notion that even though this was a sin, but it was a sin that needed to take place for a greater good that would result from it, the idea of struggle and work and creating goodness out of chaos and out of darkness. And that you wouldn't have had had there not been the Chet of the Eitz Hadas. So it's a very, very complicated point. On one hand, it's a sin. On the other hand, it was necessary. And the ultimate purpose of creation could not have been realized without that particular sin. That gets us into a very, very, very controversial and difficult idea, and that is the notion that even sin is part of Hashem's building blocks to achieve certain ends that would otherwise not be achieved. Again, a difficult idea, but there is certainly such a thought. Okay, yeah.
So what are some possible conclusions to the plan A? What plan A would have been?
Say again, Dave?
What is a possible
Well, what one possibility would have been, maybe this is the simplest possibility, that Adam had one nisayon not to eat from the Eitz Hadas, and once he would have fulfilled that one nisayon, at that point it's no longer the bread of embarrassment because we earned it by that, and that would allow us to simply receive the goodness of Hashem without any other work. As you know, the Derech Hashem says in the name of the Ari that the whole idea is that Hashem really wants to give us goodness. But for us to get goodness without earning it is the bread of embarrassment. That's Nahama de Kisufa. That's Aramaic, the bread of embarrassment. So that's why we have to struggle. That's why we have to do mitzvahs. So the idea would be under Plan A, the Nahama de Kisufa would have been removed just by that one action. And at that point, there's nothing else for us to do. We're just living in Olam Haba. Essentially, Gan Eden is essentially the life of Olam Haba in Olam Hazeh. And it just would have been Hatava. There wouldn't have been any Avodah at all. Essentially, it would have meant that we had one thing to do, and then we get Olam Haba just for that. I mean, that would be the simple understanding of it. Okay? All right. Take it. Be well.